Our speaker this evening is not only a very prolific author, every 2 years a book. Wow, I've done one, and that was it. Took a lot out of me. And he's not only a prolific author, but a speaker who is very highly sought after. And going to be speaking this evening about some of the most amazing structures here in the Hudson Valley. People who had a lot of wealth, whether they lived in the Hudson Valley or in New York City, this was a place where they wanted to come and create their very special hangout. And Tony, why don't you tell us about it?
I'm ready. I realized I didn't answer your question yet. How did I get into history? The first trip I made when I was 16, I was born and raised in Brooklyn. You'll be able to tell that as I continue to talk. Forget about it. But first trip I made with my 1962 Comet, which was my first car. I was 16 years old. And I drove to the house where George Gershwin was born. And there wasn't a plaque on it. There wasn't anything. And I was really upset that they didn't even have a plaque on his house for George Gershwin. A neighbor came out and said, "Is everything okay?" And that was my first lecture. Do you know who was born here? So that's how long I've been into this kind of stuff. Okay, the mansions I'm going to show you in tonight's presentation, and this is great resolution, this is really nice. I took them from the 3 volumes of Hidden Treasure of the Hudson Valley. And as those of you who have seen me speak before, the hidden treasures are not what I would call, you will never see me speak about the FDR home. You won't see me speak about the Vanderbilt Mansion or, Phillipsburg Manor down in Tarrytown. Those are mainstream tourist sites. I try to find the sites, even though this particular one is a tourist site, but we're going to go through, starting down in Westchester County. We're going to come up on this side of the river and then go over the bridge and come down and see a few on the other side of the river. Actually, this side of the river had the majority of the mansions on this side, rather than Ulster County and Orange County. So, I put this together because I'm a guest speaker for the Rhodes Scholars Program. When I was speaking down at the Warwick Conference Center, they wanted a 90-minute presentation because that week focused on mansions. They visited mansions every day, and I was a guest speaker one night. So I trimmed it down, so we're not going to be doing 90 minutes. I took some sites out of it, but hopefully they'll move along. So what the first site we're going to see, we're going to go down to Dobbs Ferry, New York, and this is a estate called Estherwood. James Jennings McComb gained considerable wealth when he patented his invention of the tie that secured bales of cotton as they emerged from the cotton baling machine. He relocated from Ohio to Dobbs Ferry in 1860, and he purchased a 23-acre parcel of land. After moving into a modest home close to the Miss Masters School, you heard of the Miss Masters School? Very prestigious school for young girls. And his 3 daughters went to that school. In 1894, McComb commissioned New York City architectural firm of Bookman and Deisler to design this mansion for him. The result of their work is this stunning 3.5-story French chateauist mansion built of white pressed brick and Jonesville granite trim, and a veranda that featured Gustafano ceilings. Do we know what Gustafano ceilings are? If you go down into the subway systems or anything anywhere in the country, you'll see those curved walls with white tile. That's Gustafano. It came from a Spanish architect named Rafael Gustafano. Now the building has, it's the only structure of its kind in Westchester County, and McComb christened it Estherwood. The building has 15 dormers, an oriel window on the second floor, and 4 brick chimneys on a distinctive black and red ceramic tile roof. The interior of the main floor consists of 6 large rooms, which includes this 65-foot Great Hall, which is a 2-story space topped by 2 skylights, and you can see the 2 skylights up in the corners. It had a dining room on that level fitted with dark oak paneling, and a music room, also known as a red room, which features an alcove on its northern wall that's flanked by red marble columns. A reception room called the Gold Room features 2 windows that have gold stained glass panels and brass and crystal chandeliers. The library has an octagonal skylight centered in its ceiling, and a billiard room rounds out the first floor. The upper levels were all bedrooms, and they frequently had a lot of guests at the house. They did a lot of entertaining. When it was completed in 1895, the residence was so opulent that it was compared to the Breakers, which was the Vanderbilts' famous home in Newport, Rhode Island. A Queen Anne-style carriage house was also built to the east of the mansion and still exists on the property today. McComb, unfortunately, didn't live at Estherwood too long. It was finished in 1895. He died in 1901. And 9 years after his death, his heirs sold Estherwood with the carriage house and all of the property to the Masters School. It's now called the Masters School instead of the Miss Masters School. Today, the mansion's upper bedrooms have all been converted into faculty apartments. So there are actually faculty members from the Masters School that are living here in apartments. And that's why the elevators on the first floor are locked down. You have to have a special key to get up there. But the first floor is still used for school functions and public events. And the public can get into this area here. You just can't get up to the apartments. It almost makes me want to become a faculty at the school just to live in a mansion like that. Okay, we're going to shoot all the way up now from Dobbs Ferry. We're going to go into Garrison, New York, to Eagles Rest. And in 1919, this was the home of very successful New York City brewer and the owner of the New York Yankees, Jacob Rupert, who, by the way, also had an estate up here in Rhinebeck that I wrote about in my weekly column in the Poughkeepsie Journal. The estate overlooks the Hudson River, and just to give you a geographical reference, if you look out at the river, West Point is just north of where this is located. This was originally part of a large tract of land granted by the British Crown in 1686 to Philip Felice. Now, Rupert purchased the property, was just bare property, no mansion on it, for $480,000 in 1917. He bought the Yankees in 1914, and Babe Ruth signed one of his most lucrative contracts on the lawn right in front of the front door of the mansion, and that's Rupert on his right. A lifetime bachelor, Rupert built a private zoo on the south end of his property, and it had one of the largest collections of small monkeys, wild birds, and peacocks in the world. Now, when he died in 1939, he had no heirs. He had nobody to leave it to, and this remained vacant for 5 years. Obviously, 1939, think of the world climate. We're going to be in the war in 2 years. There weren't a lot of people that were looking for an estate this size. And finally, it was sold in 1944 to Archbishop Antigoras. And what he did was he transformed the mansion and built some other buildings on the site, and it still exists as St. Basil's Academy, right along 9D. If you're going down 9D to the Bear Mountain Bridge, you'll see the big gates, and it'll say St. Basil's Academy. By the way, he paid $50,000 for the entire estate, mansion and all. So he got a good deal on that. Now, you'll see the main gates, and then if you keep driving south, you'll see soccer fields. That's where all his cages were for his private zoo, and obviously the Academy took it down. The next one, we're going to go up to a place called Matawan, which when that village combined with another village named Fishkill Landing became Beacon. But first, I was coming in the driveway to photograph the mansion at Everest, and all of a sudden my car went into total shade. And you could see it was a beautiful sunny day. Those are the only days I'll take pictures for my books. Well, I stopped the car. That's how dramatic it was. And I got out. This picture doesn't do justice how big the wings are on these eagles. And there were 2 eagles that lined the driveway as you come in off of 9D. You can actually, if you come up to the front gate and stop, you could see this eagle. It's pretty close to the road. And the story about these 2 eagles is when the Vanderbilt family was ready to knock down Grand Central Station and replace it with today's Grand Central Terminal, there were 10 eagles that lined the roof. And the Vanderbilts gave them to family members, and they gave them to close friends. And I guess because Rupert was a successful brewer and also could give them tickets to the New York Yankees, he got 2 eagles. So that was that one. And now we'll head up to Beacon. And this is Tyronde, which has actually been in the news lately. Joseph Howland was born into a wealthy New York City family in 1834, and in 1855 he married American author Eliza Woolsey. In 1859, the couple purchased 97 acres on the west side of Wolcott Avenue, or 9D, in what was then called Matawan. They named the estate Tyronde, and the reason they did that, it's an Indian word that means the meeting of the waters. And that was because on the backside of their property is the exact spot where the Fishkill Creek joins the Hudson River. So that's where they got the name from. Famed architect Frederick Clark Withers was commissioned by Howland to design the estate's Greek Revival-style mansion, which was completed in 1861. It was built with yellow brick sandstone and featured steam heat and gas lighting. So you knew they had money. This is 1861, and they were pretty good shape. In 1873, Howland's brother-in-law, also architect, Richard Morris Hunt, designed a music room for the house that was added to the mansion, and the centerpiece of that room is a massive pipe organ. Now, this picture was taken within the last 20 years, so the organ and everything is still in there. The house has been vacant for years. Soon after settling into the home, Howland enlisted in the Union Army, and in 1862 he sustained a serious injury to his thigh, and that forced his retirement from the military. He returned to Tyronde and became a very successful businessman and banker in Beacon. In 1886, while touring France on vacation, complications from his wartime injury resulted in Howland's death. He was only 55 years old at the time. The Howlands had no children, and the estate remained vacant for 20 years until Mrs. Howland donated it to the University Settlement of New York. I don't know if you know what that is. They're located right across the road from the mansion, and Pete Seeger was very involved with that during his time. In 1915, psychiatrist Clarence Slocum purchased the estate, and he founded the first privately licensed psychiatric hospital in the country in that mansion. It was named Craig House, and it became the facility of choice for the rich and famous. Patients that were treated there included Zelda Fitzgerald, the writer F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, Frances Fonda, who was Henry Fonda's wife and Peter and Jane Fonda's mother, Catherine Kennedy, who was known as the Forgotten Kennedy, JFK's sister, but Joe Kennedy didn't want her treated with the other patients in there, and so she lived in the gatehouse on the property for a number of years. That was right after the lobotomy that, he authorized her to have. And there was another very famous actress that was treated there, but she was so famous that they registered her under a fictitious name, but then it eventually came out when all the paperwork was gone through, and that happens to be Marilyn Monroe. After Slocum's death in 1950, his son took over the operation of running it, but as healthcare providers began to reduce reimbursements for mental illness, treatment of mental illness, the hospital closed permanently in 2000. Tyronde was subsequently purchased by two investors from New York City who wanted to put about 25 to 30 houses, housing development around the mansion, but they found out that the historic requirements of Beacon, they were not allowed to do that, so that project was shut down. Now, I said it's recently been in the newspaper, and the reason it's been in the newspaper is that the same folks that just built this inn and spa behind the Beekman Arms and the post office have now purchased the property, and they're going to do the same thing down there. They're going to make it an inn and spa and add some buildings to the property. Moving up along Route 9, we're going to stop in Poughkeepsie at Locust Grove, and this is primarily known as the home of Samuel F.B. Morse, but there's another story altogether about it. It was part of a larger parcel bought by Colonel Peter Schuyler from the Wappinger Indians in the 17th century, and it was sold off and divided through the years until Henry Livingston put together 385 acres through 9 separate real estate transactions. He transferred the land immediately to his son, Henry Livingston Jr. Now, Henry Livingston Jr. was actually the first person to live on this property, and he built a modest farmhouse. If you're familiar with Locust Grove, there's the main gate where you go in now, but there's a gate to the north of that gate. It's always closed now, but there's definitely a gate there. His house was right inside that gate, and that's where he would access his way in. He started to write poetry after his wife Sarah died in 1783 to kind of help him through things. He just felt it was very relaxing. He remarried in 1793, and he continued to write poetry for his own enjoyment and for his family and friends. And he had very few of his poems published. Well, Christmas morning, 1808, he comes out of his study in the house, and he had a house full of family and friends, and they were going to celebrate with Christmas dinner. He called everybody around the Christmas tree, and he said, I just wrote this in the study. I'd like to read it for you. And the name of his poem was A Visit from St. Nicholas, and it started, "'Twas the night before Christmas." One guest, a friend of his young daughter, who was visiting from New York City, was so taken back by the poem that she went to Mr. Livingston and she said, "Can I have a copy of that?" Well, unfortunately, he didn't have a Xerox machine at that time in his study, but he graciously wrote out the poem. And after dinner, she took it back to New York City with her, where she was working as the governess for New York City College professor Clement C. Moore. So you see where this is going. On December 23rd, 1823, the poem was published in the Sentinel newspaper up in Troy, New York, as author unknown. Now, Livingston died in 1928, and in 1844, a published volume of Clement Moore's poems included this poem. Well, controversy started immediately with the Livingston family because those stories had been passed on and everyone knew about it. And finally, in 2000, a professor from Vassar College did a very intensive study of Clement Moore's style of writing and Henry Livingston's, and after a year he concluded that there wasn't a doubt that Livingston wrote the poem and not Clement Moore. John and Isabella Montgomery purchased the estate in 1830, and Samuel Morse bought it from them in 1847, and it was Morse who tore down the modest farmhouse and replaced it with his mansion closer to the river. The last family that lived there through 1975 was the Young family, and then it was turned over and turned into a tourist, where people could go in and tour the place. The next site we're going to go up to Hyde Park, but I have to tell you this, when people talk about the Gilded Age, we talk about where these families like the Vanderbilts had 5 mansions and they spent 3 months here and 3 months here, and their primary residence was in New York City like most of these folks. A lot of people think of Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, Lyndhurst, all these big mansions. I'm going to argue that, in my opinion, the heart of the Gilded Age was Hyde Park and Rhinebeck. And that's my strong opinion. So we're going to go up to Hyde Park now, but remember, I just told you I don't talk about the FDR home and I don't talk about the Vanderbilt Mansion because they get tens of thousands of visitors. They're not hidden treasures. But what I wanted to do is we're going to go right next door to the Roosevelt's neighbors. So the Roosevelts lived at Springwood, and the next estate over, right bordering Springwood, was an estate called Delafield. And if you ever went to the FDR house, you know that when you drive down that long driveway, this house is on your left-hand side, the south side of the drive. It's a 2-story federal-style house built in 1795, and in 1885 was purchased by then-sitting New York State Senator Thomas Newbold. To tell you a little bit about him, he was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. He was a member of the Livingston family, but wasn't everybody back then. You're going to hear the name Livingston over and over. And he was a cousin. He had 2 very famous cousins. One was Pulitzer Prize-winning author Edith Wharton, and the other one was the first world-renowned female landscape architect, Beatrix Farrand. Now, when he moved in, he immediately enlarged the house to today's 29 rooms. He added this veranda out front. And in 1912, he called on his cousin Beatrix Farrand. Now, she had done beautiful gardens at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. She did another one in Philadelphia. And believe it or not, people travel from Europe to see her gardens. She was that famous. Well, he called her in 1912 and said, I'd like you to put a garden on my estate. Well, we know it's not on the right-hand side because that's the driveway. So she put it on the south side of the mansion, and this is known as the Beatrix Farrand mansion. We're going to fast forward now to 1973. The estate was passed on through the family, and in 1973, Newbold's grandson Gerald was baffled when he inherited. He didn't have the financial wherewithal to keep up a 29-room mansion, and the taxes in Hyde Park were climbing in the 1970s. Well, it was suggested to him, why don't you donate it to the National Park Service? Now, the National Park Service, it got him out from under his tax debt, and they were absolutely ecstatic about getting this house because they not only oversee Springwood, they oversee the Vanderbilt Mansion. So they're right in the center, and it was just a beautiful place. Now, this is a public building. You can go in there anytime, but instead of seeing a kitchen, dining room, living room, you're going to see office space and conference rooms and meeting rooms because now it's strictly headquarters. Now, they weren't going to open this to the public, technically, because they weren't going to give tours of it. And so they certainly weren't going to take care of the Beatrix Farrand garden, but out of respect for her, they carefully covered all the flower beds in the garden, and it stayed like that for 21 years, just dormant. In 1994, a group of local garden enthusiasts got together and formed the Beatrix Farrand Garden Association. They hold different fundraising events. The government gives them no money to upkeep this. In fact, I went to one tea party that they had. Well, it wasn't a tea party, it was a wine party. It was a wine party, wine and cheese in there. And that's how they generate money to buy what they need. And they're usually in there 3 days a week. And this is open all the time to the public to go in free of charge. There are 2 doors, one on the west side of the garden, another one on the east side, and they're always open. They're not locked, and you're permitted to go in there and roam around. Also in Hyde Park, we have a little village that I've become very enamored with through the years, called Staatsburg. And in Staatsburg, of course, we all know the Mills Mansion is there. There were 4 estates in Staatsburg. The best known, of course, is the Mills Mansion, and this was originally, it was first developed in 1792 by Morgan Lewis, who was the 3rd governor of New York State. He constructed a wood frame house on the same site where the mansion is today. But what happened was in 1832, a massive fire that was attributed to arson destroyed the entire house. Now, why it was attributed to arson was a lot of the big landowners back in those days, they would lease a half acre or an acre of property to what they call tenant farmers. And you could farm that land, but you had to pay rent on it to the owner of the property. Well, by the 1830s, a lot of these tenant farmers became aware that the money they kept giving to the owners far exceeded what the land itself was worth. And so they had the tenant revolt in the 1830s, and that's when his house mysteriously burned down. He replaced it right away on the same location with this 25-room mansion, and this is the mansion that was passed down through generations of Morgan Lewis's family. And look at it closely because you're going to see it a little different, but it's still standing there. Because in 1888, his great-granddaughter Ruth and her husband Ogden Mills inherited the property. And I guess 25 rooms was a little cramped for them. You know, it would be cramped for me too, I guess. And they expanded the mansion to 65 rooms. And you could see where Morgan Lewis's original mansion, it was just incorporated into the design. The first time I visited this mansion was probably about 35 years ago. I went with my late wife, and it was the first time we went to the house. And when we walked in the front door, you know, I was so used to seeing mansions with marble walls and marble floor. It just seemed very cold to me. I couldn't see myself living there. The Mills Mansion, not so much. As soon as I walked in the front foyer, which is here, all the wood paneling, finely decorated and everything. I remember turning to her and saying, "Geez, I could live here." And as was her job throughout her life, she brought me right down and said, "You couldn't afford the bathroom in this house." Thank you very much. But I mean, the house is just beautiful. This is the library. It's very, very finely decorated. And I get a lot of visitors, you know, come up from Long Island and, you know, relatives, and they want to visit places, and I always take them to the Mills Mansion. And I always tell them, come back for the month of December, because what they do is every year they decorate it a different year exactly the way the Mills would have decorated it. So this is one year that they decorated it for Christmas according to the Mills property. Okay, so we know about the Mills Mansion. If you go south of the Mills Mansion, the next estate that butted right up against it was the Point, and that was the Hoyt family. The estate was established by a successful Manhattan merchant, Lydic Munson Hoyt, and his wife Blanche Geraldine Livingston. It's a 7-bedroom house designed by Calvert Vaux in 1855. Now, the last occupant, because this was passed down through the generation, the last occupants to live there were a namesake descendant, Lydic Hoyt, and his wife, Helen Hoyt. Lydic died in 1959, and in 1962, New York State did, in my mind, the unimaginable. They cited eminent domain on this entire estate and forced Helen Hoyt to leave the estate. And this was a beloved family estate. She was devastated because, you know, it had been in her husband's family for so long. What the state said that they were going to do was knock the mansion down and put a public swimming pool there as part of Margaret Lewis Norrie State Park. Like they didn't have enough property. I'm getting on my soapbox right now, I know, but it's just horrible. She left, she was so devastated, she left all her clothes in the house, she even left the car in the garage, got on a train, went back to her primary house in New York City and never came to Staatsburg again. Well, the Staatsburgers, as they're called, the people in the village, knew her very well. She was the most visible of all the estate owners. She went to the post office every day to pick up her mail. She went to church at St. Margaret's Church in the village. She knew a lot of the villagers, and they went into an uproar, so much so that the state backed off their plan. But they didn't give the estate back to her. They boarded up the entire mansion, and from 1962 until about 2 or 3 years ago, that's the way it remained, just boarded up. Fortunately, a couple of years ago, the Calvert Vaux Foundation in New York City got some federal and state grants, and they are now in the process, as we speak, restoring the whole place. And hopefully it's going to be open to the public once they finish it. So the swimming pool never went into the park either, by the way.
There was a pool in the property. It was her.
Yeah, her pool. Yeah, no, they wanted a massive pool. Okay, so we have the Locust, then we have the Mills Estate. The next one going north is the Locust, and that remains the only private estate in the village today. But this estate was originally developed by Henry Brockhurst Livingston, who was a justice on the Supreme Court appointed by President Thomas Jefferson. In 1797, he's the one that gave the estate the name the Locust after the number of black locust trees that were on the grounds. In 1871, William Dinsmore, who was the president of a successful rail and shipping firm, acquired the property, and he built this 4-story, 92-room Italianate-style mansion. He also spearheaded the creation of a 9-hole golf course across what's today Old Post Road. It used to be the main road. That used to be Route 9. But he created a 9-hole golf course because his property extended there. And today that has the distinction of being the second oldest private golf course in the country. Of course, the state has added another 9 holes to it, and now it's open to the public. Now, there's a second chapter that goes with this estate, and that involves his granddaughter. His granddaughter lived on the 4th estate, which was right next to this one called Hopewell House, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Her name was Helen Huntington. She married Vincent Astor. They were married for a couple of decades, and his philandering got to her, and she divorced him and remarried Lydell Hull. And she was left. She inherited the grandfather's mansion and the estate. She felt that this home was too big and certainly not her style, so she tore it down. And she replaced it with a more modest neo-Baroque type of a mansion that is now still on the property today. To tell you a little bit about Helen Huntington Astor Hull, you need a scorecard. She was the founder of the New York City Opera. She was a board member of the New York City Ballet, the Metropolitan Opera, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra, and Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. And when I was interviewing people for my book, Staatsburg, A Village Lost in Time, some of the old timers remembered helicopters. She didn't have the pool. That was recently put in afterward. The helicopter would land there and take it down to New York City to performances. After her death in 1976, the estate was sold out of the family. It went through Bob Guccione, the publisher of Penthouse magazine. In fact, his wife died while they were living there, and she was buried on the property. I haven't been able to find out if she's still there. And now it's owned by Belize, Andres Belize. He owns a lot of high-end hotels all around the world. And when he bought this, he was going to make it a boutique hotel until the town board in Hyde Park said, no, there won't be any hotels in Staatsburg. And so what he does now is he rents it out for 5 days. If you want to have a wedding here, you rent it out. You can't have the wedding, you could use the bedrooms for your wedding party and everything, but you have to have a tent for the wedding. You have to get your caterer, you have to get your music, you have to have all of that and clean everything up before you leave. But it's rented out, the last price I heard was $10,000 for 5 days, which doesn't seem like a bad deal. Actually, like I said, I come from Brooklyn. I have a lot of childhood friends I'm still in touch with. I was really, they know I'm an author, they're always jabbing me. And I was going to rent it for 5 days and bring them up on a weekend, tell them it was my place. I may still do that. You know, it's just the kind of person I am. Okay, let's go to Hopewell House, which is the last of the 4 estates. And this is where Helen Huntington grew up. It was the home of her father, Robert Palmer Huntington, who was an architect, and the family. It was built in 1908 and designed by her father as a 35-room Tudor Revival mansion, and it sat on 300 acres going right down to the Hudson River. Now, in addition to being a renowned architect, recently retired, because when he built this, he retired and lived here full-time, he was also a tennis champion in college and professionally. In fact, he won 2 doubles titles at the U.S. National Championships. Now, during the 1950s, Helen Hull is living next door at her new mansion. Her parents are long gone, they're long deceased, and her brother and her sister had relocated away from the area completely, had no intention of coming back. So she put the 300 acres in the mansion on the market. This is the 1950s. Kind of hard to sell a 300-acre estate with a mansion, a 35-room mansion. She left it on for almost a year, and there were no takers. And so she did what she does best. She demolished it. She demolished the hunting lodge her father had there for friends he'd invite up, and so now this acreage is open to the public, but there's nothing on it. If you go in Old Post Road, right off of Route 9, there's about a 10 or 15 space little dirt parking lot, and it's all walking trails now. And they have placards to show you what the mansion looked like and what the family looked like. But you can walk all the way down to the river. And it really is a neat place if you want to go see wildlife. And I know some wildlife photographers that they're there 3 days a week. There's a lot of wildlife in there and everything. But that's the Staatsburg estates, the 4 Staatsburg estates. Now we're going to come up to Rhinebeck. And like I said, we know that the Astor family lived here. We know that Jacob Rupert lived here. We know there were so many people that lived in Rhinebeck on estates. I picked ones that really appealed to me for not known, widely known facts. In 1853, Elizabeth Skimmerhorn Jones built this 3-story, 24-room mansion in Rhinecliff. It was so opulent that it stimulated the idiom, keeping up with the Joneses. And that's what grabbed my attention. I always like to know where these sayings came from. It was so much of a big deal that it actually inspired William Astor, who was a relative of Jones by marriage, to erect a huge mansion on his nearby property. This originally sat on 80 acres, and the property included a boathouse, carriage houses, meticulously manicured landscape grounds. Jones died in 1876, and the property was purchased by New York City brewer, a lot of brewers in this. Andrew Fink bought it in 1876. What he's known for is he put tennis courts on the property. In the late 1800s, that was getting to be fashionable to have a tennis court on the property. But he took it one step further. He put an underground pipe system from the mansion out to the tennis courts. So after you played a game of tennis, you could go over and there was a tap and you could fill up your mug with beer and have a beer after the game. His heirs sold the property in 1927, and it went through several owners afterwards who found it hard to maintain. It eventually got abandoned in the 1950s. It fell into disrepair, and then worse, a storm caused the tree limb to crash through the skylight in the top, and now you had water damage throughout the entire mansion, and it was a wreck. In 2003, a new owner erected a chain link fence around it, and his deal was that he was going to restore it to its, original heyday, but doesn't look that way. Doesn't look like it's going to happen. You have an update on that, Mike?
It's in considerably worse shape than you're looking at right there.
Yeah, it's a shame. I don't think there's any way that you could restore it. At this point, it's just there's so much damage inside. It was such a beautiful place inside with chandeliers hanging, balconies, and
Where is it located?
It's on South Mill Road.
On the right-hand side as you're going south.
As you're heading south on South Mill Road, before you get to Linwood,
Yeah,
it's on the river side, obviously. I've often wondered, Tony, that story about Andrew Fink putting a pipe between the mansions so that you could have beer down there and tennis courts. Is just how do people get back up after playing tennis and having a bunch of beer back up to the mansion?
You crawled. You crawled. This house is actually, the property's been broken up. It was 80 acres. It's now on 2 acres, and there's a number of private houses built around it now. So they say it's a private road, when you go off the main route, but you can get in there and take a picture.
Yeah, it's really a shame because it is and was quite an elegant
Magnificent,
mansion.
really, yeah.
So who owns it now?
I don't know. The person that you referred to with the chain link fence around it, I think has sold it to somebody else, and each buyer seems to entertain this fantasy that somehow they're going to restore it. But
Yeah, I think once they dig in and see what has to be done, they just back off. Yeah. Well, another estate here in Rhinebeck is Grasmere. And this is right up the road from the Rhinebeck Cemetery on the other side of the street. This was supposed to be the estate of General Richard Montgomery and his wife, Janet Livingston. The land was acquired by Montgomery in 1773, and he actually laid the foundation for the mansion just prior to being dispatched to Quebec during the Revolutionary War. Unfortunately, General Montgomery has the sorry distinction of being the first Continental Army officer killed in battle during the Revolutionary War. Now, Janet Livingston, in tribute to her husband, oversaw the construction of the mansion, actually lived there for a while, but it was very tough for her to live in that estate because her beloved husband wasn't there with her. She subsequently sold it, and she moved up to Red Hook, and we'll see that in a minute. Subsequent residents that lived at Grasmere included Lady Kitty Dower, Lord Stirling's daughter, future New York Governor Morgan Lewis, who was Janet Livingston's brother-in-law, and Louise Clues Timpson, the former Duchess of Argyll. So we had some royalty living here. Now, when Janet Livingston sold this, in 1802, at 59 years old, she purchased 242 acres in Annandale-on-Hudson, just south of Bard College. She named the estate Chateau de Montgomery in honor of her husband, and that chateau part of it was because her brother Robert was the minister to France at the time. She oversaw an extensive series of orchards, a nursery, and a greenhouse. And when she died in 1828, she left the estate to a younger brother, Edgewood, who had been a mayor of New York City, a congressman, and a U.S. senator from Louisiana. Now, it was Edgewood's Haitian-born wife, Louise, who wanted to Americanize the name, and she changed it from Chateau de Montgomery to Montgomery Place. She also was responsible for adding the porches and the wings on both sides of the main block that Janet Livingston had. The property stayed in the Livingston family through 1986 when it was sold to Historic Hudson Valley. And that's the group that's down in Tarrytown. They oversee Lindenhurst, Kykuit, Phillipsburg Manor. And I just don't think they got the amount of visitors at this site that they were getting down below in Tarrytown, and they ended up giving it up. It's now owned by Bard College. And let's just hope we get a regular schedule of tours through here again for the public, because it's a beautiful house inside. And speaking of Bard College, this is Blightwood. This land was purchased from local Indians in 1680 by Colonel Peter Schuyler. In the 1700s, the early 1700s, General John Armstrong purchased it and named the estate Mill Hill because there were a number of mills that were located along the Sawkill Creek, which bordered the property. Armstrong converted a 1.5-story barn into a federal-style home on the property. And in 1883, Robert Donaldson purchased 95 acres for $19,000. It was his wife, Susan, that renamed the estate Blightwood. And blight in Old English is a word that means joyous. 20 years later, 1853, Donaldson and his family moved to another pretty nice mansion called Edgewater in Barrytown, right on the Hudson River, and sold Blightwood to John Bard. Now, John Bard is the one who donated a corner of his property to establish St. Stephen's College several years after he moved in here. And of course, St. Stephen's College, after Bard's death, was renamed in his honor. Andrew Zabreski bought the property in 1899, and he was the one that tore down the federal-style home and built this 30-room mansion. He also established a formal garden west of the mansion, overlooking the Hudson River. Zabreski's son inherited the property, and in 1951 he donated the entire estate to Bard College, and now the mansion is used as the Levy Economics Institute. And this garden is open. It's just like the rest of the campus. You can just stroll on it. I often take, a book if I want to do. Most of the time, I'm at Norrie Park along the Hudson River with a beach chair reading a book. But I've gone here a few times, and it's very peaceful. It doesn't get many visitors, and it's a great place to visit. Before I go any further north, I want to go inland because there's an interesting estate in Millbrook that I want to go through. And Millbrook had a lot of celebrities and a lot of high-end people. And this is actually the cover of Volume 1 of Hidden Treasures of the Hudson Valley. It's the gatehouse for an estate called Danheim. Danheim was established in the 1890s by Charles Dietrich, and he founded a company that evolved into Union Carbide, and he got great wealth out of that. When he died in 1927, Margaret Hitchcock bought the property, and Margaret Hitchcock is from the Mellon family, as in Mellon Bank. The grounds feature a lake, cottages, barns, a bowling alley, and this beautiful Queen Anne Manor. So mansions come in all styles, all types of material, and this is quite a building. I went through this building some years back. The way the story goes is Tommy Hitchcock, Margaret's son, met and developed a friendship with Dr. Timothy Leary in the early 60s, and this is when everything went south. In 1963, when Harvard fired Dr. Leary for advocating the use of LSD, Tommy Hitchcock offered Dr. Leary the use of the estate and this house for $500 a month. Wish I would have known him then, but I probably didn't have the $500 in 1963. It became Leary's headquarters for quite a few years, and in 1964 he wrote his famous book, The Psychedelic Experience, while he was living here. The estate became the site of endless parties, drug exploration. Around the lake there was up to 200 hippies living in tents and teepees, and everybody was using drugs. And it was visited by a lot of famous people: beat poet Allen Ginsberg, jazz musicians Charles Mingus and Maynard Ferguson were frequent visitors. And on one occasion, a school bus came riding up what's today Route 44 or Salisbury Turnpike, whatever you want to call it. And it had speakers on the roof and it was blasting rock and roll music. It was the Merry Pranksters. The Merry Pranksters was a group that was led by author Ken Kesey. And Ken Kesey had all these authors, musicians, and everything, and all they did was travel around the country and party. Now, I said they came in a 1939 school bus, but this is an actual picture of what that school bus looked like. Well, this is the mansion when Timothy Leary was living there. This is during that time that he lived there, so you can see what he did. The bedrooms, Timothy Leary's bedroom was here on the second floor. It was huge. I couldn't believe the fellow John Foreman invited me there to take me through the house. And I did meet Tommy Hitchcock, too. But this is what the Merry Pranksters look like. Now, if you know Millbrook, pastoral, quiet, horse farms, I got to imagine the locals were going crazy with this. Well, they went through that gatehouse with this bus. This is Ken Kesey, by the way, right up here. They went through the gatehouse. They went through the long driveway, pulled up next to that beautiful Queen Anne manor house, and they stayed there an entire week. And when I was writing the chapter on this, I searched and searched for months. I can't find one reference to their stay there for the 7 days that they were there. They probably don't remember it. And that's why there's nothing existing. Well, it all came to an end in 1966 because the businessmen and especially parents in the area were getting concerned. The gates were never closed. Kids were drifting in there. I spoke to a fellow. I interviewed a fellow that was a 14-year-old drummer in a rock and roll band, lived in Millbrook. And he went in there and he said he started going in all the time. He saw Leary all the time, and we had a pretty good interview. And I'll leave it at this. He had a career as a drug counselor at one of the facilities. So, it ended in 1966 when law enforcement raided the place. And that raid was led by then Dutchess County Assistant District Attorney and later Watergate figure G. Gordon Liddy. And Margaret Hamilton had it. She evicted Leary off the property, and all the hippies had to take their tents and pack and leave. Okay, the next one was the original slide that I had on the beginning of the program, and this is the seat of the Livingston family. The property that they own with 13,000 acres consisted of Dutchess County, and 1/3 of today's Columbia County was all Livingston property. It was inherited in 1728 by Robert Livingston. Now, the Livingston family has 1 million Roberts and 1 million Margarets, so you would need a scorecard if you tried to keep, but I'll try to make it as clear as I can. Robert Livingston oversaw construction of a brick Georgian-style mansion, and he named it Claremont, and in French that means Clear Mountain. If you've ever been to this property and go around the back and look over the river and see the Catskill Mountains, you'll know why he named it that. Now, his son, named Robert, married Margaret Beekman, and the Beekman family owned significant land in Dutchess and Ulster County. So now that couple really owned a lot of property. The most prominent person to live at Claremont was Robert R. Livingston Jr., and he was the Chancellor of New York State and administered the oath of office to George Washington as our first president. He was also a member of the Committee of Five, drafted the Declaration of the Independence, and was the first Minister of Foreign Affairs, which today is called the Secretary of State. In 1777, when the British came up the river and they burned down Kingston, they were actually headed for Saratoga. They knew that the Livingstons supported independence, and so they came up out of their ships and they burned down that mansion. To show you the clout that this family had, Margaret Beekman petitioned our first governor, George Clinton, to rebuild the mansion on the same foundation. And he actually called people back from the war to build this mansion for the family. So this dates to 1777. Between 1801 and 1804, Chancellor Livingston was appointed minister to France by President Thomas Jefferson, and we spoke about that. That's why Chateau de Montgomery was named for the brother. Livingston negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, and he met inventor Robert Fulton. Together they built the first steamboat, and Claremont became its home port. He died in 1813 and left Claremont to his eldest daughter, and the family owned this place until 1962, when it was deeded to New York State and it was open to the public. And if you haven't been there, it's a nice place to visit. A lot of history up there. And the last one we're going to see on this side of the river is near Hudson, New York. I call this Frederick Church's greatest artwork. Frederick Church, 19th century American landscape painter that was considered the central figure in that era's Hudson River School of Art movement. He was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1826 and relocated to New York at 18 years old to become a student of Thomas Cole, whose house is actually in the city of Kingston, right across the river from here today. Catskill, what did I say? Sorry, Catskill. The two men worked together for 4 years until Cole's death in 1848. Now, having gained immediate success, Church we're talking about, he returned to the hillside across from Cole's house, right here, and he previously had done a number of sketches on that hillside, so he knew it well. He purchased a farm on the southern end of the hill and eventually built a cottage halfway up. In 1867, he purchased another parcel at the top of the hill, and 2 years later began to design this mansion there. Working with noted architect Calvert Vaughn, Church incorporated many of the elements he reserved while traveling through Europe and the Middle East into his home's design. The 2-year project resulted in a mansion that features many Eastern details, although the reality of it is it's a 2-story Italian villa, distinctive because of its 3-story tower and Second Empire roof. The home's exterior features reddish-brown slate-colored tiles, polychrome brickwork, and limestone Moorish arches. Its interior features unique fireplaces, extensive carvings, wall hangings, rugs, and elaborate ornamentation. And many of the items displayed come from Church and his wife's extensive travels. This happens to be his art studio, and you can see the large window he put for the northern light. The structure boasts 37 rooms and was named Olana after an equally impressive home of the same name that he saw in Persia. He added scenic carriage trails and formal gardens to the property throughout his lifetime. Now, Church's wife Isabel died in 1899, and Church died 1 year later. The house was inherited by their son Louis, who owned it through his own death in the 1960s. At that point, a nephew inherited the property, and when he made it known that he was going to sell the entire estate to housing developers to make a housing development around the mansion, fortunately, we had a governor that was very, very into art at that time, Nelson Rockefeller, and he matched the state funds, and the state purchased, and that's why today the state still owns it and gives tours of the house. Has everyone been to the Olana? There's nothing you could say but great about it. It's a beautiful place. So let's cross over the Rip Van Winkle Bridge and head south to the city of Kingston. And this is the Edgewood Terrace mansion. Perched high atop a hillside in the city of Kingston is this 19th century Second Empire style mansion of merchant and brick manufacturer John H. Courts. It sits on 9 acres, and Courts built the 3-story structure in 1873, just south of the Courts and Hutton Brickworks, an operation that he founded in 1865. During the late 19th century, the company flourished and eventually became one of the largest brickwork operations in the region. In 1880, it manufactured 16 million bricks and employed 100 people. Aside from his involvement in brick manufacturing, Courts had other interests in real estate and shipping. Now, the mansion, which he christened Edgewood Terrace, was built with slate-sloping concave mansard roof, a central tower, and a column front porch veranda. The home's front entrance was fitted with wooden double doors, each of which contained glass panels etched with floral designs. The interior includes 28 rooms, 9 of which are bedrooms, and one of the 2 staircases is located in the grand center hall. Numerous chandeliers, other lighting fixtures, and elaborate ceiling medallions exist throughout the home, reflecting the prosperity and affluence of the owner. The tower is accessed from a stairway at the front of the 3rd floor, and it features arched windows on all 4 sides. The grounds surrounding the mansion are occupied by a carriage house, gazebo, and other outbuildings. Courts retired from brickmaking in 1887, and the operation continued to exist as the Hutton Brickyard, the Hutton Brick Company, through the 1960s. Courts died in 1891. The estate passed on to his son, who entered politics, and then on to his grandchildren. When the last child died in 1986, the property was sold out of the family, which ended the family's 113-year residency on the site, and it remains privately owned today. Just south of Kingston, we go to Esopus, to the Colonel Oliver Payne mansion. This mansion is 42,000 square feet, and it was built by Civil War officer and successful businessman Colonel Oliver Payne. The estate totaled 800 acres, including extensive gardens and a stable complex. Now, after the Civil War, Payne acquired wealth, engaged in iron manufacturing, and founding an oil refinery. That oil refinery was purchased by a childhood schoolmate of his back in Ohio named John Rockefeller. And that made Payne a principal stockholder in what became Standard Oil Company. He moved to New York in 1894, and in 1905 he purchased 2 estates in Esopus, 600 acres on the west side of 9W, 200 acres on the riverside of 9W. And he combined it for his combined estate. He had the mansion modeled after one that he saw while traveling on the Italian coast. He also had an ocean-worthy yacht, 260-foot yacht, that he kept right below the mansion on the Hudson River. This yacht, 260 feet long, had marble fireplaces and walnut panels. Oliver Payne was also a lifetime bachelor. He left his estate to his nephew, Henry Payne Bingham, who was actually fighting in World War I overseas when he inherited the estate. So his family moved in, but his wife it was too big for her. She was overwhelmed with it. And when he got back from the war, to relieve his tax burden, he donated it to the Protestant Episcopal Mission Society. It operated a school for boys there through 1966. The school was on the west side of 9W. It was the 600 acres. And I'm a very big boxing fan, and I became close friends with Floyd Patterson, who lived in New Paltz, who actually offered my son free boxing lessons, and he passed on it. But I don't blame him for that. I used to take him to the Hall of Fame every year, the Boxing Hall of Fame, and he says, Dad, they talk funny. And their nose is like this, and their ear. So he turned down the lessons. But Floyd Patterson told me that he was one of the students at that school, and that's how he found the Hudson Valley and eventually settled in New Paltz. The 200 acres on the east side, or the riverside of 9W, was used for a convalescent home for the poor. The Maris brothers purchased the riverside parcel and used it as a seminary, and the mansion's great hall was converted into a chapel. In 1986, a wealthy businessman named Raymond A. Rich bought the mansion in 60 acres, and he meticulously restored the mansion to its original luster. He died in 2009, and he left the entire estate, mansion and all, to Marist College. It was valued at $65 million. Raymond A. Rich Institute for Leadership is now located in the mansion. It's operated by Marist College, and the whole property is still, the Marist brothers live there. You could see those big gates. You'll see the gatehouse and the big gates as you're driving up 9W. You can't miss them. And the last one we're going to do is down in Newburgh, and that is called Algonac. Built in the Bombville section of Newburgh in 1852 for Warren Delano and his wife Catherine, this was the childhood home of Sarah Delano, the future mother of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Sarah met a distant cousin, James Roosevelt, at a party, and after a courtship, they married on this estate in 1880. The name Algonac means hill and river, and the mansion was located on 60 acres overlooking the Hudson River. It's just north of the Beacon-Newburgh Bridge. Following his birth in 1882, Franklin Roosevelt made many trips down to Algonac to visit his grandfather. Following Warren and Catherine Delano's deaths in the 1890s, the estate was inherited by their daughter Anne and her husband Fred Hitch. But the mansion sustained serious damage in a fire in 1916, and the architects Calvert Vaux and Andrew Jackson Downing were hired to redesign the home into a more Italianite mansion. The new residence was covered with fawn-colored stucco and crowned with a 3-story tower. The property passed on to Sarah's younger brother, Frederick Delano, who lived his life there through his death in 1953, after which the family sold it to the Broadman Enterprises in Stony Point. Now, the Broadman Enterprises is a housing development firm who subdivided the 60 acres and built 124 ranch-style and split-level homes all around the mansion. The last owner of the mansion was Eugene Littman and his wife, and Littman's family owned a commercial lighting company in Cornwall. Littman died in 2013, and following his wife's death in January 2021, the contents of the mansion were auctioned off. The historic residence, now in the midst of a housing development along Susan Drive in Bombville, is currently on the market, if anybody's interested. The asking price is $2.9 million. I'm just $2 million short. So it's up for grabs. And that's the presentation on the mansions, but I'd love to take some questions.